Just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded.
We should go ahead, Pamela.
Sure.
Okay. Well, welcome, everybody. I think we'll start the way we do at the library these days by reading the equity statement. The trustees of the Boston Public Library reaffirm our commitment to racial equity and to principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly. The library is formally committed to becoming an anti-racist organization in response to systemic racism, inequity, and injustice prevalent in our society. We acknowledge also that the Boston Public Library's central library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem providing sustenance to the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We're committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement that will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. So Pamela, do you want to take roll call now or?
Sure thing. And just a reminder to members of the public, if you'd like to sign up for public comment, please do so by writing your name in the chat and that you'd like to sign up for public comment. I'm just going to read last names for efficiency's sake. Ben, Asim.
Here.
Berman.
Here.
Bradley.
Here.
Dames.
Here.
Enriquez. Fay, absent. Hawkins is absent. Johnson is absent. Leonard.
Here.
And Leventhal.
Here.
Thank you so much. Back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Pamela. I'd like to make just a few short remarks on this, our first meeting of the new Special Elections Committee and my first as chairman. You know, we have so many treasures in our special collections, such as original Shakespeare plays, prints from Rembrandt and Toulouse-Lautrec, original photos from early Boston, the American West and the Civil War, rare books from early American literature and history, a valuable anti-slavery collection of artifacts, books, documents, letters, and pamphlets from the family of William Lloyd Garrison in the 1890s. And we have so much more. The problem is hardly anyone knows about any of this. I think we need to enhance the visibility of the collection, tell its story, get it out from the stacks, as it were, and have regular exhibitions for the public. We'll be better positioned to do this and have more space when the McKim renovation is done. But we have plans, I think you'll hear more about today, to soon hold exhibits of our music collection and then photos and rare books. We could also explore collaborations with other cultural institutions in and around Boston, like the MFA, the Athenaeum, the Museum of Science, or the Peabody Essex Museum. Anyway, these are just some thoughts I wanted to share about ways that I think our special collections could better be shared with the public. And I'd love to hear from each of the committee members on what you're most interested in doing while on the committee, and some of the things you'd like to see us accomplish as a group. So maybe we could go around the room before we get to the rest of the program featuring Laura and Beth, and around the room, so to speak, and starting with Matthew Dames. We're very lucky to have someone with such broad experience in the library world as Matthew serving as vice chair. He's currently president of the Association of Research Libraries and the head librarian at Notre Dame University. And before that, as most of you know, he headed the libraries at BU, Georgetown, and Syracuse. So Matthew, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. First of all, good morning. Second of all, I'm glad to be on this call and be a part of this committee. I really appreciate what the Boston Public Library has done in the past and what it's looking forward to what it's going to do in the future. To what you were saying, Ben, about the special collections, one of the things that has changed in my library career is that at one time, your reputation in special collections was forged pretty much by what you had. And now it's forged by what you can make accessible. And so to the extent that we have great holdings, and there's no doubt that BPL has great holdings, really the charge is to try to make those holdings as accessible in as many ways as possible to the library's various and myriad constituencies, whether within the Commonwealth or beyond. And so I see a great opportunity here to work with David Leonard, to work with you, to work with this committee, to really enhance the reputation and the utility and the work of BPL's professionals, including Laura and Beth, as we'll hear in a minute. And I'm looking forward to working on this committee. Thanks.
Thank you. Priscilla, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being members of this special collections. I don't have anything to add, Ben, because I like the vision that you outlined. I like what Matthew said about the accessibility and visibility, and I applaud the extraordinary collection that we have and letting more people have access to it and raising the visibility of the BPL. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Jabari?
Good morning, everyone. Just listening to the comments already. One of the thoughts that I had, I've been to a couple of events in recent years with cultural institutions in which staged readings were presented by, say, 3 or 4 actors and a director based directly on the holdings. And so that's one of the partnerships that I'd like to see happen in terms of programming, perhaps partnerships with performing arts organizations in Boston. There's a surplus of performing talent, and it was really kind of fascinating. Ben, you mentioned the anti-slavery collection. One of the readings I went to was a collection of abolitionist papers, essentially read, not actually memorized, but read. The actors stood at podiums and read the letters, but of course, because they were actors, they came alive in a way that perhaps they wouldn't ordinarily. So that's one of the partnerships I'd like to see, and can certainly contribute to helping make happen. Thanks.
That's interesting. Where was that reading, Jabari?
It was a couple of them. One was the Athenaeum. I can't remember where the, might have been the Museum of Fine Arts, maybe. And I remember one of the, let's see, Boston Poets Theater, I think, was one of the institutions that read. And the other one was Company One, where the actors read from papers. And I'm really interested, there's a new arts collective, the Front Porch Arts Collective in Boston, which I think would be a wonderful potential partner for this kind of thing.
That's good. Thank you for that detail. Let's see. Joe Berman?
Thanks, Ben. And I want to pick up on what Jabari just said, but I'm going to first mention that I sort of have a unique role here because I'm actually a member of the board of the Associates of the Boston Public Library, which is an independent organization, 501c3 organization, whose mission is to raise funds to help conserve the special collections of this library. So I really straddle both worlds. And so I have a particular interest in the special collections, and I totally agree with you, Ben, that we need to make these more accessible and available to the public. Picking up on what Jabari just said, you know, we have a new initiative through some generous donors to the Associates called the Pierce Performance Series, which just last month put on a wonderful new original play called Onward about the women's suffrage movement. What they are doing, Jabari, is exactly what you wanted, which is to use some of the special collections and bring them alive through performing arts. So I think that's a great start, and I would love to see us collaborate with other institutions in Boston. So I know Beth can talk about this more in a little while, but you know, the Associates of the Boston Public Library is dedicated to really this mission, and I think it's totally aligned, Ben, with what you want to be doing.
Thank you for that. I'd read about that Pierce Performance Series. That sounded really interesting. Let's see, who else? Is Juan Enriquez here or not? I guess not. Alan Leventhal?
Thank you, Ben. I just want to say I'm just delighted to be part of this committee. It's my first meeting. I welcome all the comments I've heard so far and look forward to playing a constructive role.
Great. David Leonard, did you want to weigh in at this point? Is David with us?
Sorry, if you can come back to me about 5 minutes, that'd be great.
Okay, fine. Well, then let's proceed with the rest of the agenda, which would be the special collections report. And is that Laura first?
Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you all today. So I actually wanted to start by sharing some news. I do want to double check. Can everybody hear me okay? I've been having some technology issues. Okay, thank you so much. So I did want to share a little bit of news with you that I'm actually leaving the BPL. In January 14th will be my last day. I am moving to Connecticut. So I wanted to thank you all for being on this new committee. And I'm so excited for the work that you all are doing. I've been working closely with Beth for the last 6 years on special collections specifically. And we're so excited for you to get to know the team and the work that they're doing. There's so many great things ahead of us for special collections. And I know that you all are in good hands with the team here at the BPL. But before we started, I just wanted to let you know that. And so our report is some general updates for you. And I wanted to start with an update on the rare books renovation. So you may recall that our rare book space is nearing completion of the renovation. We're looking at a later 2022 opening. And so right now there's so much activity happening in the space. One of the main goals for the project was to have an environmental and mechanical system that supported the preservation needs of the collection. So they're doing some commissioning work now to make sure that all of the engineering is matching the actual systems that were built, and they're working out all the kinks and testing everything now. And they're also installing shelving, and it's quite a sight to see. We have over 6.5 miles of shelving going into this department. So that gives you just a little image of how much metal is going up into the department that will be holding all of our treasures in the rare books and manuscripts department. And we are hoping to be able to give you much more details in the spring as we head closer to the completion of that project. So I'm going to hand it over to Beth for some more updates, and I think we're both happy to take any questions that anyone might have too.
Laura, thanks for all your years of service, and sorry to hear that you're going to be leaving, but best of luck in your new endeavors.
Thank you.
If I could interject just before we turn to Beth, sorry, I'm now at my desk. So administratively, we want to thank Laura for an amazing tenure here and just all of the accomplishments that we will certainly be marking before her actual departure in a couple of weeks. But there's no question but our collections in general and our special collections in particular are in so much better shape than they were without her and the team's work. So we will make administrative announcements in due course about an interim plan to cover responsibilities and ensure that our initiatives and strategy continues to move forward, as well as in due course a longer term arrangement. But we are taking a moment to just examine the best way for the next chapter of collection strategy as we go forward. I do want to go back and just add my own thoughts as a committee member to this question of our focus. We have effectively been on a 5+ year journey for the reestablishment of a priority of special collections within the Boston Public Library. And to use the same phrase again, we are really with the reestablishment of this committee and the reopening of the Rare Books and Manuscripts Department later next year, really looking to the next chapter. Although it is the Rare Books and Manuscripts Department that is being renovated and will reopen next year, it touches a lot of special collections. And so I think it's important to note that this is one of the infrastructure pieces that we complete in a preparation also for further work on the McKim project in the coming decade. And so I think those together may indeed reestablish the library's interest and duties and responsibilities with respect to not just special collections, but our research collections more broadly as well. So this is a very important moment in many ways. While we heard about the importance and the focus and the necessity of shifting to availability and accessibility, I would go further and suggest it is the use cases or the engagement with the collections that makes possible, whether through exhibitions that we will put on again in due course, partnerships that we have with other institutions, or collaborative initiatives such as the ones with the associates that have already been mentioned. All of those together take us into the arena of engagement. But to engage means we have to have collections that are accessible, and that means we have to both know what we have and store them appropriately and manage and preserve and conserve. So it really is about holding all of these principles in balance. So I just want to remind us that jumping simply to availability and accessibility or engagement without the necessary other steps would be an incomplete approach to the picture. So with that in mind, I will just hand back to Beth, who will lead us through the core, I believe, of our presentation to today.
Can I just jump in 1 second? Because when you talked about the ongoing engagement, one piece, Alan, you didn't talk about is a Leventhal Map Center, which from all the major events, that is an ongoing way for the public to engage with our collection, from immigration to now maps and deceptions. So I just want to make certain that that's on the table. It's a very strong collaboration, and there's a lot of best practices there.
And indeed,
So,
is our only special collections department that has continued to have consistent ongoing exhibitions while the other departments are offline or undergoing renovations.
David or Ben, may I make a comment for a second? Would it be appropriate?
Yes.
Please.
So I thank you for mentioning that, Priscilla. I think the remarkable thing about the partnership that the Map Center has with the library is that its ability to display, its ability to have exhibitions, its ability to expand in the digital world. And I believe the extraordinary collections of the library, what we're talking about at this meeting, not only does it provide us opportunity in the digital world, but it also strengthens our location to draw people in. So I think we have a unique opportunity. I think the exhibits at the Leventhal Map Center, the attendance of those exhibits, the engagement, the education work being done by Garrett Nelson, the president of the Map Center, I think is an extraordinary time. And I'll give you one small example. When the Ever Given ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, I think it may be the largest ship in the world. In 10 minutes at home, Garrett Nelson came up with a tweet which showed the Ever Given in the Charles River, showed it in Boston Harbor, and provided an app that enabled people to put it anywhere in the world. And I forget how many million tweets we had in a very short period of time, but people think about that as the Boston Public Library, and it's using the information we have in the digital world as a way to enhance what we do. And we have such power with our collection to do good in the world and correct a lot of the challenges and mistakes of the past. So I view this in a very positive, exciting way, the opportunity for the library.
Thank you, Alan. Beth, are you coming on?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to share some good news about hiring. In our last meeting, we talked about the many vacancies that we have within special collections, and I think David referenced overall at the library and the work that we're doing to fill those positions. And so it's been a very busy fall for us. One of the most exciting announcements I have is that we have made a selection for our public services librarian. This is the person who will be overseeing the new special collections reading room, which services all of the special collections for BPL with the exception of the Map Center. We have hired Kathleen Monahan from Boston College. She has an extraordinary record of service with the special collections units at BC, and we're delighted to have her join us in January as we plan for that program of service and welcoming the public back in mid-2022. We also have a number of positions that we are actively interviewing for this December. It's been a really busy time right before the end of the year. We have 2 open archivist positions that we are interviewing for actually this week. I'm sitting on that committee and we're interviewing for this week and next. We have some outstanding candidates actually from both locally and from around the country. We're actively interviewing for our conservation officer, our conservator position within the Conservation Lab. Those interviews are also happening as we speak, the first round, and we expect to be through that process by the end of the year in terms of the first round. We have a library assistant position that we're actively interviewing for externally. And finally, we have a research collections manager position, which will, again, is a position that has not existed for many years and will have oversight over the vast research collections, which, as we know, and as we talked about a bit at the last meeting, also are deeply entwined with special collections and in fact contain many collections that should be considered special collections in many forms. And so that position has been posted externally, and we hope to start interviews for that soon. So we're really looking forward in 2022 to completing that process and to welcoming a lot of new staff members to the library. And we're excited about the expertise and the energy that, again, those new staff members will bring, and that has been a major focus of our work over this fall. We also have some really exciting updates in terms of our grants. We have, as you know, we are supported both from the city, excuse me, and from trust funds, but also notably from our philanthropic arms. And so I wanted to do just a couple quick notes on that. First is that last time we talked about our founding research collection. Those are the sort of foundational materials by which our status as a research library was created, with hundreds of thousands of volumes that were added to the collection throughout the 19th and early 20th century, collections that really are in need of cleaning, of description, and of access. We received major funding through the fund, through an anonymous donor, and through the Associates of the Boston Public Library in order to start that work on a portion of that collection. And this fall, we issued an RFP to hire a project manager, a contract to oversee that work. I'm delighted to say that we have selected our candidate. We are still waiting to finalize the specifics, so I can't make an announcement on the specific person yet, but we look forward actually to having that person meet you, joining us in January and meeting this committee and talking about that work in meetings to come. So this is a major step forward for us with that project. It's a major project that's a multi-year project. We have a newspaper grant through the National Digital Newspaper Program for us to digitize from microfilm thousands of images from our newspaper collection. That's kicked off under the stewardship of our digital partners team. And then the Leventhal Map Center has also received a major grant in partnership with Mount Vernon. I'm not going to do the reveal for that, but what I am going to reveal is that in our February meeting, it's interesting, but both Priscilla Allen and David all mentioned the partnership with the Leventhal Map Center, and the Map Center team will be joining us at this meeting in February to talk about their work, to talk about their collections, to talk about the priority of that team. And I'm really excited to have them participate within this special collections committee and talk about the really important work that they're doing with both stewardship of the collection and their focus on access and program, which is something that has already been discussed within the context of this meeting. So I'm happy to answer any questions about those updates before we move into the next portion of this committee meeting.
Does anyone have any questions for Beth?
And feel free to add anything to flag me or add anything if something comes up. Well, then I'm delighted to move to the next portion of our committee meeting, which is to introduce one of our staff members who will take you on a wonderful tour of one of our outstanding special collections. We had talked about the opportunity within the context of this meeting to introduce you to, in some greater detail, into our work, into our holdings, into our priorities, and into what is coming up with projects and discoveries within our collections. And so I'm delighted to introduce Jared Rex. We'll be focusing on our music collection during this meeting. And Jared is the BPL's curator of music. We've talked about how generous external funding supports the BPL special collections and our mission. Jared's position has been funded through the Associates of the Boston Public Library. And he joined the BPL a little over a year ago from the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, where he served as the music librarian. Jared has a graduate degree in music librarianship and music theory from the University of Buffalo, and his undergraduate degree is from Boston Conservatory, where he majored in piano. He's an active member of the New England Music Library Association. As his colleagues, over the last year, we've been incredibly impressed with Jared's passion for the field of music history and librarianship, his intrepid research and investigatory abilities, especially as he delves for information about the BPL's own collections, and his extensive technical and reference skills. I think it's important to note that Jared joined us mid-pandemic when we were still in our work from home phase. We have only been on site full-time since July, but the depth with which he's been able to explore a collection remotely on two levels, one not physically being in the building, but also the fact that much of the music collection has been offsite for a number of years because as part of the Rare Books renovation. That has not stopped our intrepid Jared, and I'm delighted to introduce him now to talk about his background, to share some background about the collection and some of his wonderful discoveries. So I'd like to welcome Jared.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that wonderful introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic, wonderful. So I just wanted to talk to you about sort of orienting yourselves to the music special collections if you're not aware of the treasures that are here. And of course, we've been amassing these collections for almost 175 years. And so there's no way I can cover everything in this presentation. But what I hope that you leave today with is a better understanding of some of the music special collections and treasures that are here at BPL. Just so that, because I think music in general is always one of those subjects that is very abstract. And even within the music community, I think a lot of people aren't really aware of the wonderful things that are here. So who am I? So Beth gave you my brief bio, but I'm a particular stakeholder in BPL's music special collections because they contributed to my intellectual growth as a young person, especially at Boston Conservatory. And so while I was a pianist at Boston Conservatory, I went through a hand injury, which ended to my right hand, which ended my career as a pianist. But being at a conservatory, one can't switch majors. And so I had to finish 2 years of my career playing pieces for piano left hand alone. And within a couple of months, I played almost every published work for piano left hand alone. And I was left trying to find pieces to play for, I had chamber music requirements, I had ensemble requirements. And so I went on really a national search to find repertoire for piano left hand alone, and particularly chamber ensemble. And that search led me to places like the Library of Congress, Music Division, the New York Public Library of the Performing Arts, which is definitely our sister institution. But of all places, it led me here, and it didn't lead me to the circulating collection, even though I had used that extensively as an undergrad, just as a patron, but it led me to the Alan Brown collection, which is one of the collections I'll be talking to you today about. And what I found in the Brown collection were these unpublished pieces for piano left hand alone. I found one for piano left-handed chamber ensemble, and it was really the Alan Brown collection that saved my career as a pianist and was able to get me through my undergraduate studies. And so after using the collection and after becoming more and more familiar with the types of materials that are here at BPL, it's a bit cliche, but this position of curator of music has been a dream job of mine since I entered library school. And the reason why is because there are unparalleled music collections here that I think so many people, music librarians, would be so lucky to be able to steward. And one might say that about all of our collections here, but I think that music in particular, as you'll see from this presentation, has been a fabric of our collecting habits and practices from really the inception of the library. And so one of the things I'm really excited to do is just to work with these wonderful music collections to make them accessible to the public, as was mentioned in many of the comments about special collections earlier from members of the committee, and to promote and get people using this material and becoming more aware of it. So a lot of what I do every day, I answer research questions from scholars around the world who are interested in our holdings. I work with our preservation team and special collections to flag items that need conservation work in order to be digitized. I have sent over 550 volumes of music to the Internet Archive since I started work for digitization. And so what I'm trying to do is to interpret our collections and assess the user needs, not just of the city of Boston, but also for the musicological community at large, because having a music collection like this is not just for the citizens of Boston, even though that is primarily our focus, but the treasures that are here are such that people all around the world want to know more about our music collections. And as we'll see, that has been a theme of our music activities really since the library was founded. But there are challenges, of course, that go along with any collection that's probably circa 1 million items or more in terms of musical items, and that depends on what kinds of counts you're counting in terms of statistics. So that's a whole different topic. But I want you to understand that there are hundreds of thousands of musical objects here, and it's very hard to get intellectual control over all of them, to know where they are at all times, to have them adequately described in terms of bibliographic data that would be in our online catalog. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about the BPL is that we were founded before national standards in terms of library practices, right? So we were founded before the Library of Congress classification became standard. We were founded before the Dewey Decimal classification became standard. We were founded before there were any type of national cataloging standards. And so what we have and what I've inherited in this wonderful music collection is 1 million different ways to describe objects. And it's only within delving into that history as to why we're doing what we're doing, why we're describing what we're describing, and also understanding the deficiencies of systems like that, particularly with racist verbiage that might appear in card catalog indices. Those are all issues that we're grappling with. And I think for music in particular, one of the challenges is that most of the music holdings are not available online. And I don't mean just in a digitized state, I mean in our online catalog, Polaris. in archive space, which is a new system for finding aids that was recently launched in special collections. So really a user, if they're looking to see if we have a particular score or musical object, would ideally need to actually consult me or send an email or send or call us, because we have such extensive music holdings, and we've been collecting music since the inception of BPL in the 1850s. And so it's not possible at present to just be able to search everything comprehensively due to many different types of challenges. And with music has always been difficult to describe adequately, especially to provide the same type of access in terms of bibliographic description to every single object in the same way. And I think in particular, it makes it a very interesting and unique challenge. But on the user end of it, I think a lot of people have forgotten about the treasures that we have here. And so my entire essence of being here is to get our holdings out to our communities, to the citizens of Boston, to Boston Public Schools, to music conservatories in Boston, but also the musical community at large, whether that's the symphony orchestra community, the musicological community, et cetera, because those are our constituencies. And so I think global, but yet I'm acting locally, I think is really is where I'm going with this. So next slide, please. So just a very, very quick rundown of the types of formats that we have in our music special collections. One of the things I think people are surprised to find out is that we have almost no recorded sound. By recorded sound, I mean LPs, CDs, 8-track tapes, reel-to-reel. We had a very large sound archive of about 2 million items, which was sent to the Internet Archive, I believe, in 2017 for digitization and storage. So when we talk about music special collections, there are archival recordings that are present, but really what I'm referring to are printed objects or manuscript objects in many ways. And so I think that I just point that out because I think a lot of people are surprised to find that out. So some of the materials that you'll find in our wonderful special collections, and I have some examples of these in forthcoming slides, are autograph and manuscript scores. So that is a musical score written in the hand of the composers, such as Mozart, Prokofiev, etc. Published scores. So we have a particular focus on first and early editions of music. And the way in which music was printed might mean that the first German edition of a piece is different from the first Italian edition, from the first American edition, from the first British edition. So we have a lot of first editions, but in music, a first edition might mean many things, early editions. We also have rare editions. I would say in particular, a lot of the rarity of our collections appears to be in early Americana imprints of music, and which we'll get to in a minute. And we have a substantial collection of early printed music, which would be dated before 1801 throughout the world. We also have collections of scores that contain intrinsic value attributes. And what I mean by that are a score that belonged to a conductor, say Sergei Koussevitzky, we have 2,500 annotated scores from. And Koussevitzky would mark scores to conduct the Boston Symphony, right? And so his markings indicate his interpretation, right? And that's how his markings would have been copied into the parts, say, that the Boston Symphony was playing. And so when one looks at these scores, say in the Koussevitzky collection, it's very easy to get inside Koussevitzky's head, who has been dead for, 60, 70 years now, and understand Koussevitzky's interpretation and how the Boston Symphony would have performed a particular work based on his markings. So we have, so markings like that are just irreplaceable, and there are, collections of annotated scores throughout the world. But in particular, Koussevitzky did a lot of world premieres, and very excited about that collection. So in terms of music scores, especially if they're marked in the hand of somebody of renown in the music world, can actually add even more value to a researcher than just having a first edition. We have monographs, and by what I mean by that is books and journals, of course, from a historical perspective. There's loads of manuscript material, autographed letters from almost every primary and secondary composer imaginable. We have archival collections, and what I mean by that are the records of organizations. The collection that comes to mind are the Handel and Haydn Society archives that we have, in addition to many other archival collections. And we have a substantial amount of performance ephemera, so concert programs, first Boston or world premiere concerts. We have ticket stubs from Boston Symphony concerts. We have broadsides, advertisements for concerts in Boston and in the United States. And the performance ephemera is also a part of the collection that is really unparalleled, at least in terms of Boston and New England history by other collections. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are just examples from digitized materials from the collections, just so that you can get a very quick glimpse of the types of material that you find. So what is on this slide is probably one of our more famous artifacts, which is our autograph score from Mozart, which is a fugue that was composed around 1780. And being that it's in the hand of Mozart, of course, this is as close to Mozart or any composer as we'll get. For this piece in particular, Mozart didn't complete it. You'll see that the first, say, 3/4 of this is in Mozart's hand, but it was actually completed by one of Mozart's friends, who I believe was one of his pupils, Stadler. And so this is an example of where I think there's teachable moments for any serious music student or even the general public in an example like this, because Mozart, of course, was writing this out, but like many Mozart works, it wasn't finished and it was completed by somebody else, which is really what the verbiage at the bottom of the page specifies. So I think that this is just, and again, these are just examples from the collections. This is from the Brown collection of some of the artifacts we hold. Next slide, please. And so in terms of published scores, first and early editions, here is an example of the first edition of Beethoven Symphony No. 9. And if you don't know the piece by the serial number, it's the Ode to Joy that we all know. We've heard in many commercials, and you'll see on page 160, the Ode to Joy starts in the middle of the page. This was an artifact when I found it in the stacks. I was starting to tear up because I just, this is, unless we have the autograph, this is really as close to Beethoven as we're going to get for this piece. Next slide, please. So in terms of an example of early printed music pre-1801, what you'll see here is an excerpt of the first edition of John Dowland's First Book of Songs from 1597. And there are 3 other known copies of this work in the world, including being held by the British Library. And I just like to point out that this is an example of something that I think so many libraries would be jealous of. And it's an example of tablature, so you'll see that the notation looks different than you might be familiar with in terms of what music looks like, because it's notation for lute, guitar, or plucked instruments. So it looks a tad different. Next slide, please. And so one of my favorite things I've come across so far is this is a copyist manuscript score for Johann Sebastian Bach's famous work, the Goldberg Variations. And again, if you don't know this work by the name, you've certainly heard it in television and movies, etc. And why this artifact speaks to me in particular is because there are very few works that were published in Bach's lifetime, but this was one of them. And it was published in 1741. But a lot of Bach's works were disseminated through copyist manuscripts by his pupils, by people that knew Bach in Leipzig. And this is one of these artifacts. So it's been dated, again, I haven't seen this in person. It's one of the challenges about curating music currently until the collections are back. So, but we've digitized this. So I've spent some time looking at it. And it's been estimated that it was copied in a year after the Goldberg Variations was printed in Leipzig by the actual printer, Balthasar Schmidt. So not only is this being copied by someone that knew Bach, but it's also the person that actually printed the Goldberg Variations. And so what I find that's interesting about this, and without doing a side-by-side comparison, I can't tell you the differences, but it is very likely that this version of this copyist manuscript contains markings, emendations, annotations, potentially even changes of note. There might be sections that are rewritten that became standard practice after the piece was published. And that's why a copyist manuscript in music is invaluable. And so this is something that is in the Brown collection. I'm super excited to work with once it comes back. And there's some other copyist manuscripts as well from the same nature of works that were copied shortly after they were published in Leipzig. Next slide, please. And so this is a fun example that I've shown this a couple of times, and people kind of like, what are you sure you put the orientation of the slide correctly? So this is an example of a table book from John Dallen's second book of songs from 1600. And table books were made to be placed on a table and displayed in such a way that the performers can read the parts while being seated or standing around a table. So it's a now extinct and defunct music printing format, which is displayed here in a digitized version of the second book of songs. So again, I just like to show off just some very unique things that that are here. Next slide, please. And in the spirit of kind of somewhat antiquated formats or extinct notation systems, here's an example of shape note notation from the musical primer from 1811. This is the third edition, published by Andrew Law, who was one of the he's one of the first people who spearheaded shape note notation, the purpose of which is that each pitch has a different shape. And so instead of learning how to read a staff, one would just need to recognize the shape and know exactly what pitch to sing. This is an example actually of something that you'd find in our early 19th century American religious music publications. And so we have loads of shape note notation. Next slide, please. So now that you've had a very, very quick overview of just a couple of artifacts that I truly enjoy, I sort of just want to pivot to the next portion, which actually makes up the bulk of my presentation, just keeping in mind the time here. And this is what I've been doing thus far in my work here. It's consumed a lot of time and research, which is reconstructing the music departmental history and special collections from print records, files, and outside primary, secondary, and sometimes tertiary sources. We have about 75, and that number is my best guesstimate, but we may have more, 75 music special collections. And so I'm going to be talking to you today about 2 of them, but to just think about 75 completely separate collections, trying to identify what the restrictions are, where the collections came from, the deed of gifts, what are we allowed to do with the collections, what is contained in the collections. All of that requires reading a lot of print documentation to reconstruct how our collections came to be. And I think, at least in terms of what I know of musicology and music history, that's the best way, in my opinion, to be able to view our collections is through the lens of how they were created, because the better we understand how we got the stuff, the better we can understand how to get it out to the public. Why are these collections at Boston Public Library? It's a good question that I ask myself daily. Next slide, please. So the outline of the rest of my presentation is the history of our founding music special collections from the founding of the library through 1916. And my primary focus is on, I would say if you ask me, what are the 2 most important special collections? Important is a relative word, correct? But but I think if you want to know what musicologists and what the music community consider to be the 2 most special collections out of everything we have would be the Joseph Koudelka collection, which came to the library in 1859, and the Alan Brown collection of music, which came in 1894. Now, I cannot go into all of our music special collections, which one could argue are equally as special, but these are what put this library on the map in New England, in Boston, the International Music Collection map of the world, really. And so these are important collections that we need to promote, and we need to educate everybody that they're here, but also about what they contain and how they came to be. So what I've tried to do just for this talk is to place our collections in a historical context that weaves through the history of American music librarianship and collections, Boston music history, and more broadly, the history of music collections throughout the United States. And as we will see, I think one of the things that gets me super excited is that from the founding of the library, music has always been a priority in terms of collecting practices and collecting habits. So much so that 5 years after the reading room opened, our first music special collection was acquired. I mean, that is substantial in terms of American history, let alone American music history. And what the historical record tells us is that BPL became the first freely available and publicly accessible music collection in the United States, although it was not the first music collection. Next slide. So we'll get to this in just a minute, but I just wanted to frame just a quick timeline of musical events in Boston that led up to the founding of BPL, because they influence why these collections came to be. New England, of course, had a tradition of singing schools starting in the early 1700s because everyone forgot how to sing psalms. And so what you find is that in almost every community in New England, singing schools are popping up, and the goal was to be able to educate the general public to sing psalms in church and to sing them well. By 1770, we have William Billings, who becomes the first Boston composer of renown, publishing the New England Psalm Singer, and which we hold a first edition of, which was actually engraved by Paul Revere. So a very important moment in American music history. Up to that point, there really hadn't been a text that had been compiled by an American composer, printed by an American composer and his friends. In 1815, the Handel and Heinz Society is founded. Of course, they're still active today, and we have their archives. And in 1837, the Harvard Musical Association is founded, where I had worked for quite a few years. And that's really the first music library in the United States. It was founded in Cambridge, and then they broke ties with Harvard and they moved to Boston. So our collections and the establishment of them came out of the Harvard Musical Association's philanthropic work to educate Boston's musical public in a higher version of art music, whatever you want to call it. They were really preoccupied with making sure that everyone was educated in a Western art music, classical music tradition. And there's certainly deficiencies there. So in terms of music libraries in the United States, what we get before 1837 is that music is being collected in libraries, but there's not a concerted effort to build a music collection until the Harvard Musical Association is founded. Music was notoriously difficult to acquire in the United States. It was very expensive. There were few American publishers, so a lot of classical music was being imported from Europe, particularly Germany. And so public libraries did not have the resources to collect music because it was so expensive, and it was printed in limited runs, and et cetera, et cetera. And even though we think of the Library of Congress as being one of the nation's oldest libraries, they were only collecting music through copyright deposits at this point. So really, there's no one until 1837 that's really trying to start a music library. Out of the libraries that were founded before BPL in the United States, 5 of them had substantial music collections, and they were all in Massachusetts. They were the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Boston Athenaeum, the American Antiquarian Society, the Harvard Musical Association, and the American Congregational Association Library. So our collecting habits are stemming from a push for the members of the general public to be able to access music materials, which were already very expensive, very rare. Also from a push for music education. In 1838, Lowell Mason added music to the curriculum of Boston Public Schools. And so when we think about the Boston Public Library opening our first reading room in, I believe, 1854, it truly stems out of a desire to make music more accessible to just members of the general public. And when one looks at the early accession logs for BPL, what we find is that music was being collected here, at least books on music, 2 years before the reading room even opened in 1852. Some of the titles are the first, for instance, scholarly biography of Mozart, printed in 1845, as well as they tend to be monographs on music. So when I found this, and within my research, I was astounded because there was clearly a need for this material in this country. but yet our early founders were very preoccupied with collecting music. And I think that that's something that was not common. What I know of just the history of music librarianship was not common in this country at all. So that leads us to our current slide with Dwight's Journal of Music. So in 1852, John Sullivan Dwight, who essentially became America's first serious music critic, he founded the Harvard Musical Association. Again, we have very close ties to the founders there. But John Sullivan Dwight was a transcendentalist. He lived at Brook Farm. There's a collection of letters and special collections that he wrote at Brook Farm. And so John Sullivan Dwight he's basically the person in Boston at this point that's trying to promote the serious study of music. And so he launches a self-published journal in 1852 called Dwight's Journal of Music. And we have most of a run of it, except a couple of years that we're missing. And he reports on so many aspects of American music life at this point, including concert reviews, this critical commentary, op-eds, but there's a primary focus on Boston musical life. And given that Dwight and all of his circles at the Harvard Musical Association and in Boston at this point in history are pivotal stakeholders in promoting music, it's no surprise that on October 20th, 1855, slightly over 1.5 years after the original reading room opens, Dwight mentions the Boston Public Library's music collections. Quote, "We may mention a hopeful symptom which presented itself to us a few days since that excellent new institution, the Public Library of Boston. A volume of bona fide music was shown to us by one of the librarians as a work just imported. By the large and admirable policy of that library, every citizen may call for books, and every book called for and not belonging to the library is immediately procured and added. As the first draft for music has been so promptly honored, may we not indulge a hope that the Boston Public Library will one day become a valuable depository of music as well as literature and science." And I think Dwight would be shocked today to find out how amazing our music collections are. And so about a year later, there's another mention of our music collections because, that was just kind of, again, I'm trying to frame this through the lens of the people who were stakeholders in founding our collections. So 2.5 years later, Dwight again reports on a shared focus on building music collections at BPL, although Dwight's really preoccupied on building complete collections, which was something in musicology throughout the world at this point. We wanted all of the works of Mozart. We wanted all of the works of Beethoven, all of these, people from the Western art music canon. So in 1853, on February 13th, Dwight reports, quote, "Every citizen of Boston has now at his command a library destined in a few years to rank among the finest in the United States, and possibly to rank with at least the second class of great libraries of Europe. We want in Boston a complete collection of the works of the great masters of music. Suppose now that our musical societies of all kinds should see fit in an effort to obtain this for the public library, could it not be done?" And so already in 1858, the music community is saying that we need collaboration with the BPL. We are stakeholders in this collection. We want it to grow. We want the public to be able to access it. But putting completeness aside, in 1858 as well, on October 2nd, finally, the first mention of a special collection at BPL for music is made in Dwight's journal. And due to the substantial length of the entry, I'm not going to read the entire entry, but it's easy to deduce that the musical public in Boston was extremely excited about the prospect of obtaining this collection for the Boston Public Library, given the large amount of detail that's found in the excerpt of the article. Next slide, please. So that leads us to our first collection that I'd like to just touch on today, which is the Joseph Koudelka collection, which came in 1858. It was the first major music acquisition here at BPL, totaling around 500 volumes. The collection principally contains early imprints of many of the most important and influential writers of the early years of Western classical music. So it tends to be music theory treatises from the late medieval to entire Renaissance periods, early printed music. And some of the items are so precious that they're one of few, and in some cases, no other known extant copies throughout the world. So how did this acquisition come to be, and who were the stakeholders that made this possible for BPL? Next slide, please. So Baron Joseph von Koudelka, of course, was the collector who amassed this collection, and he was born in Vienna in 1773, and he died in 1850. He was an officer of the Imperial and Royal Prussian Army, and he rose through the military ranks and therefore really traveled around Europe as part of his job. And after 48 years of distinguished service, he retired and devoted his life to two ambitions, art and music history. As a music historian, Koudelka was thoroughly knowledgeable in the history of sacred music in particular, and as part of his deep interest in music, he collected books on the subject, which I, again, suspect came from his travels throughout Europe within the army. The collection is so varied in terms of imprints and publishers that it's really, it comes from almost all countries in Europe up to this point. And so it's really impossible to know the provenance of where he acquired so many books. Next slide, please. So the next person that's an integral player here is Alexander Thayer, who essentially wrote the first biography of Beethoven in 1866. So the Boston Public Library sent Thayer to the auction. The Koudelka's collection was being auctioned in 1859. And Thayer is the one that essentially was present at the auction, and he thought the collection was incomplete, so he added 100 volumes just from his own collection and bought additional items for the collection. Next slide, please. And of course, collections were very expensive, so the other person that is an integral player here is Joshua Bates, who we all know as being one of the primary benefactors of the library from when it started. So Bates is the one that put up the funds, and I believe we paid Thayer $100 for his services to represent us at the auction. So in 1859, in BPL's annual report, finally, there's a mention of this collection, and it says, quote, anyone knowing the extreme rarity of books on music, particularly of the 15th and 16th centuries, will be surprised at the richness of this collection. And I think that that's substantial for being written in 1859. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you a brief example of the auction catalog, which we do have in Music Special Collections. And so we did not purchase every item in the collection that was up for sale, but we purchased the majority, I'd say, estimating 90% of what was available. And I just put a quote, which we don't have time to read, but essentially, even everyone in Europe was really excited about the rarity of some of the items in this collection. Next slide, please. So just to show you an item from the collection, again, we don't have time to go into all of these fantastic treasures that I'd keep you for hours and you'd be very bored. But this is Arkadelt's first through, I believe, the 5th book of madrigals that were printed in 1543 to 1546. These are part books, meaning it's an antiquated format again, where each vocal part is printed as a separate entity. And so you have to use all of the parts in order to make the piece happen instead of printing them on one page as a score. So again, not enough time to go into everything today. Next slide, please. So Dwight is very excited about the collection coming here. And so there's so much praise in Dwight's journal about the Koudelka collection. So much so that I think the thing that for me was so shocking was that Dwight and his circle knew how rare this material was even in 1858, 1859, so much so that they go into such detail about how important it is. But after this collection comes, there's a lot of Boston musical life happening in a very short amount of time. So in 1865, the Harvard Musical Association starts giving subscription orchestra concerts, the first subscription orchestra concerts in Boston. In 1867, we have our two conservatories in Boston, the Boston Conservatory and New England Conservatory are founded. In 1870, Harvard University is finally collecting music, and in 1881, the Boston Symphony is founded. And so in a matter of 2 decades, Boston musical life explodes. Even though we expanded at a great pace, our collections did not. And so in 1870, the Board of Trustees asked John Knowles Payne, who was the first professor of music at Harvard starting in 1861, and he's attributed to be known as the first American orchestral composer to reach international prominence. He commissioned, the trustees commissioned a report to outline the deficiencies in the collection. And one of the things that John Knowles Payne is very upset about is that we don't have a substantial collection of opera, among other particular score formats. By 1880, in what we know as today as the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, which is the standard reference work for music, it's what I trained every undergraduate to consult first at Holy Cross. The first edition of that in 1880 states that although the Boston Public Library is the largest music library in the United States, about 2,000 volumes, little effort has been given into increasing this department. And so BPL essentially goes static. By 1883, William Apthorpe, who's a Boston music critic, is again asked by the Board of Trustees to frame a report. And what comes out of his report about the music collections is that we should partner with local ensembles, performing arts organizations. And he specifically mentions the Boston Symphony of other organizations, which was founded 2 years prior to this report. Next slide, please. So going in, understanding with, to regurgitate some of the things that were said earlier about collaboration with local ensembles. I don't know if you can see it on the slide, but at the bottom of the program page, this is a program from 1923, you'll see that for decades on the program page of every Boston Symphony concert, there was verbiage that said, quote, "The works to be played at these concerts may be seen in the Allen A. Brown Music Collection of the Boston Public Library 1 week before the concert." And this is just an example of a very long-standing collaboration between these two institutions who are integral to Boston's musical life. Next slide, please. So in the last couple of minutes we have, I just want to briefly tell you about the Allen Brown collection, which I would say is the collection that I get the most reference inquiries about out of everything that we have. And it's an integral collection to American music history. It's an integral to Boston's musical life. And it's a collection that's grown up to this day because Brown left us trust funds to grow the collection, which now totals over 40,000 volumes. This is what put BPL on the map internationally for possessing a foundational collection of musical treasures and truly preeminent music collections. And it was given to us upon the completion of the McKim Building in 1894. And it started off as just around 7,000 volumes. Next slide. So this is a photograph of Brown, just so that you can see what Brown looked like. He was born in Boston in 1835, and he collected music based on his personal interest in music. He made frequent trips to Europe to actually acquire the music, which is one of the reasons why there's so much diversity in terms of music and formats in this collection. A quote from Barbara Duncan, I love this quote, that summarizes Brown's essence of collecting, quote, "When his activity in the London music shops came to the ears of the British Museum, which is now the British Library, they said to one particular dealer, 'We hear that a rich American is buying scores for you. Hereafter, when you have anything to sell, let us see it first.'" So Brown was really in the trenches trying to acquire music materials for himself. Next slide. And so what you find in the collection is just a diversity of music publishing formats. There's operas, there's oratorios, there's orchestral music, there's concert programs and ephemera relating to Boston concerts. And he donated it while he was still alive and continued to add to the collection. And so he would come to the library about 3 days a week to add volumes to the collection and cut out ephemera from newspapers, concert reviews, programs, and he'd paste them into the front and backs of each of the scores in his collection. And so the practice of collecting ephemera has resulted in a very important and otherwise non-duplicated source of performing data for scholars. It's very rare for a donor to be so active in stewarding a collection after it's given and wanting to grow it and coming to the library on his own time free. Next slide, please. So this is a photograph of what the Brown collection looked like in its original room, which is now the Chevres room. You'll see that this is, it looks like they're all scores on the shelf. And so there are countless autograph and manuscript scores in this collection, and I unfortunately just don't have time to go into all of the amazingness of this collection. But what I would point out in particular is that Brown documented Boston musical life in such a way that he created scrapbooks also of ephemera. And there are scrapbooks relating to the founding of the Boston Symphony from 1881 that contain information that the Boston Symphony does not have. And we received an NEH grant in 1995 to microfilm those scrapbooks. So that's just one small example of how integral and important this collection was. And you'll see I didn't provide images of the collections because all of the treasures I showed you at the beginning of this presentation are all from the Brown collection. Next slide, please. So this is just another photo of the room from 1895, just so you could see what it looked like. Next slide, please. I promise I'm almost done. So what made Brown's donation so important? And I've articulated, again, I'm rushing through this, but I've articulated a couple of things. What you should take away from this is that there are it's a collection that is not a static collection. It's a collection that's still growing to this day through the trust funds that were left from Alan Brown, from Isabella Stewart Gardner in memory of B.J. Lang in 1925, which says that money from those trusts have to be added to the Brown collection. So there's a lot of, it's a collection that we continue to develop as I think one of the most important parts of it. Some quotes quickly. The first one just is from, I think it's from 1911, just saying that every form of music is represented. The second one from 1915 says, quote, "This library is in some respects the most valuable collection of its kind in the United States." And I think that that's really important to celebrate. A quote from Philip Hale, who is, and you can go to the next slide, please, who is actually the responsible for the first other special collection of music that came after Brown, says in 1922, quote, "Other libraries may have some rarer treatises and possibly some scores that are missing in this collection, but those treatises and scores are few. No musical library in this country or in Europe, and these words are not written carelessly, is of so great aid to any student of high or low degree. No library is so accessible to a sudden wish or necessity for consultation, and no library is so interesting to the general or curious reader." And I think that summarizes our collections, especially the Brown collection, in such a beautiful way, much more eloquent than I could. Next slide, please, because just so you know, I found out that Brown actually is the one that alerted Joshua Bates and everyone else that the Kadaka collection came on the auction market. So really all of our founding collections stem from Alan. Just a couple of other music special collections that hopefully I'll be able to talk to you at a later point about that are important. The Philip Hale collection, which is essentially a journalistic archive of Boston musical activities, came in 1935. The Sergei Kosovitsky collection in 1967. Came from his house at Tanglewood, and of course he was the founder of Tanglewood and music director of the Boston Symphony for about 2 decades. The Handel and Haydn Society archives in 1976, which I'm super excited to work with once the collections come back. It's one of my there's so many early imprints of music, and it's just a treasure trove of wonderful things. And of course, the Walter Piston collection came in 1978, which is who was a music theorist and is very integral to music theory. And so that is all I have for you today. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. I apologize if I was moving through this too quickly, but I hope it doesn't matter if you remember any specifics that I mentioned, but I hope that you take away from this that music is very integral to the operations of Boston Public Library and Boston in general. And it's so exciting to be part of such influential collections in the history of American music, in the history of music. And I am dedicated to making these collections accessible, given all of their challenges of formats and description and et cetera. And it's really been a pleasure to be able to work with them. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive presentation. A lot, if not all, new to me and very interesting. We've talked about Jared having a presentation of sorts, an exhibition from your department as one of our first exhibition initiatives. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to showcase the treasures that we have. I think because the collection spanned the whole gamut of music history, it's almost challenging to just pick a couple of objects that most represent how important these collections are. And so I think I am excited to do that. I'm excited to work with, hopefully, classes, and I want people to come in and use this material. I don't want it sitting on the shelf. So I think exhibitions are a wonderful way to get the word out about our collections. I think that the hardest challenge for me, I think, would be selecting and narrowing down just what I'd want to showcase, because the list is endless. But I think that especially if there's a digital counterpart as part of an exhibition, one of the things I think that you'll find is that most of our music collections have not been digitized. And so one of the priorities that we're looking into is how we can digitize the collections. Some of it material is very fragile. And so we're looking into digitizing microfilm reproductions and et cetera. So.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's virtually no sound as part of the collection right now because it's being digitized, right?
Well, so the recorded sound portion actually was sent to the Internet Archive to be digitized. So I believe they're still in the process of doing that, but our archival recordings that you'll find in some of our special collections like the Piston or the Koussevitzky collection have not yet been digitized. And so once that material comes back, again, I don't have access to it at present because of the renovation. I'm planning on looking into how we can make that material accessible, especially because it's in antiquated formats like reel-to-reel and test pressings of recordings and things that could be damaged even listening to it once. So,
but if we were to go ahead with an exhibition, a music exhibition, would it be possible to have a sound component, however brief?
Yes, I think so. And actually, one of the special collections that we have is the Pro Art Chamber Orchestra's archives, which is a local Boston ensemble. And I think in 2003, the whole music at BPL was from the Pro Art Chamber Orchestra's recordings from our collection. So I think that there are many opportunities to be able to do an interactive and multimedia component with our holdings. It's just a matter of figuring out, and again, with copyright clearance and things like that, what we're able to do.
And if we had this exhibition, I assume you would be available to narrate it, so to speak, and guide people who can't even read music like me to show us what we're seeing?
Yes, and I hope that was clear in today's talk too. Like I never assume that anybody is a musician, that anybody is trained. I'm excited about these artifacts because of their importance in just history in general. And I think for the music community, it's even more special for them to be able to come in and touch an autograph score of Mozart or something like that. But I'm all about trying to get people to come in and use the material, even if they have no prior musical knowledge.
Great. Does anyone else have some questions for Jared?
I'd like to intervene, and then it looks like Joe has his hand up as well. So I want to thank Jared for, essentially, since he got here, simply rolling up his sleeves virtually and digging into this collection and discovering these treasures. We've really been waiting for three things to happen. One was to have new expertise that we haven't had really a dedicated curator since probably for about 10 years at this point. And the agenda at that time was different anyway. Secondly, COVID has delayed us in terms of some activities, both on the curatorial side as well as on the partnership side that I want to reference in a second. And thirdly, obviously, while it's the Rare Books Department collection that's off-site, the music collection is adjacent to that and was displaced. And so we are waiting for that to come back at the same time as the rare books and manuscripts do come back too. Although what of the music collection should actually be in rare books and manuscripts, and what should in special collections, and what should be more properly and more generally a research collection. That's a nuance that we'll be dealing with behind the scenes in due course. On the partnerships front, both the BSO and the Handel and Haydn Society, as well as Berkeley, the New England Conservatory, and the Boston Conservatory that's now part of Berkeley, all have expressed interest and have had early conversations even prior to Jared getting here. And one of the first Pierce performance pieces that the associates put on actually pulled from the music collection. And so we have done, in that case, a performance versus an exhibition. I think in the context of a music collection, the distinction between performance and exhibition starts to blur a little bit. So that's in an exciting way. So we will certainly be getting to more of that in due course. So I think much more to follow. And I'm particularly excited with the new head of the BSO being in place. I think we're due to meet one-on-one in person because our collections actually are complementary. And Gail wants to move the agenda of engaging young people in the schools with classical music in a much more deliberate way than was already happening under the previous leadership at the BSO. And so I'm looking forward to engaging in that conversation and seeing how we could complement, supplement, and support that work. Joe?
Sure. If I can, Ben, I just wanted to first compliment Jared. I think this is the second time I've heard this presentation, and I learned something every time. I think in your personal story or your connection to the collection is really great. A question that I asked you the last time I saw you speak, I'm going to repeat again, just because I think it's important to talk about this. Obviously, most of our collection is pre-20th century, and I'm wondering what we have, with jazz, blues, early rock and roll, other kinds of contemporary music, whether that's part of the collection, featuring more diverse artists and musicians and composers, and whether that's something that should be acquired if we had the budget for it, and how, we're sort of expanding the holdings beyond sort of pre-20th century music.
It's a very good question, and one that unfortunately, just due to the presentation, we don't have time to go into, so thank you for asking it. Among the many other music special collections that we have, there are collections of non-Western art music. For instance, the Metropolitan Theater Collection is a collection of circa 3,000 scores and parts to silent film movies used by the Metropolitan Theater that is now the Wang Theater when they were doing silent films. And so that's a collection that unfortunately I haven't had time to really delve into. There's no finding aid for it. It's not cataloged. We have the Marchard Orchestra Collection, which was a jazz dance band that toured around New England in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And so that's, again, a collection that's special. There's parts that are marked by the musicians in the group. It tells us a lot about jazz performance, at least in New England at that point in history. I think one of the really, truly exciting collections that I want to promote is the Roland Hayes collection. And if you're not familiar with Roland Hayes, he was the first African-American vocalist to sing at Symphony Hall, which he sponsored himself. And we actually have an entire archival collection of letters from Roland Hayes, his touring concert programs. There's records of almost everywhere he went. And in the 1970s, he gifted the collection to the library, and we had a celebration about it. And that's a collection that I think has been neglected, and it is one of my priorities to make that material accessible. And I am so happy that we have that collection. And in terms of other genres of music, I think that we do fall down in music in the last 20 years. For instance, hip hop, although there's other places in Boston that are trying to acquire that. And my collecting trajectory is not just to collect treasures of the past, but to also like Alan Brown, document Boston's musical life so that when I leave this position, it's better than what I found it, especially in terms of the diversity of music that's represented in special collections. It's easy for me to sit here and say that to you. Doing the work is actually the hard part. And especially working with our constituencies in the areas and trying to acquire in a very concerted and curated way, specific collections that will document all of Boston's musical life, not just a white European perspective, which unfortunately is a lot of our collections, and I did focus on that a lot today. But even though I've just talked to you about for an hour about that, I am very preoccupied with trying to include all voices in our collection, especially historically neglected voices.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions for Jared? Well, thank you so much then again, Jared, for that great presentation, including your own inspiring personal story. And David, it's good to hear about collaboration opportunities like with the BSO and Handle It Hayden and the others that you mentioned. That would be really good, I think, if we could pursue those. So if there's not any other questions for Jared, thank you again. And Pamela, what do we do next? New business, are we at?
You could ask if there's any new business. And then I just wanted to let you know, we do not have anyone signed up for public comment.
Okay. Does anyone have any new business they would like to raise?
New committee, no new business.
Okay. Well, we covered it all, so there's no new business to raise, I guess. Anyway,
In terms of future agendas, just to remind everybody, our goal with this series of meetings this year was to orient the committee really to particular holdings within special collections. We started with our first meeting. This is the second meeting on music. Beth has introduced that Garrett Nelson, President and Senior Curator at the Leventhal Map Center, will present at the next meeting, and then we'll be closer to the opening of rare books and manuscripts. So our intention at this point would be to open with the following meeting focused in that area, leading into in-person review of the new space, and then a soft and soft opening and ribbon cutting in due course. So in some ways, we think that trajectory brings you all up to speed as we go forward. So it's not technically new business, but it's the future business that we'll be picking up.
And David, on a possible music exhibition, are we ready to sort of pencil in a possible date for that?
I would say no. I think we need to get the collection back, and that's the focus of this team for the balance most of this year. I think at some point we will be through COVID and be able to turn our attention more explicitly to future in-person programming writ large. We had started a practice of having a 3 to 5 year agenda for exhibitions and programmatic themes. And I think sometime in 22, we want to revisit that. And I think in the context of that planning exercises, those planning exercises, which we can do with all of you as well, that's the right context to get to the penciling in, like what's the right order, what anniversaries are coming up, which collections should we highlight. I think there's a lot more of the ingredients that need to happen. And I think the most recent large exhibitions, and Beth certainly can speak to this, both around Shakespeare, around manuscripts, around Toulouse-Lautrec, those were really successful when they were done in partnership with other key institutions. And so I think in the context of music, we would want to be a little further along with our key partnerships to understand, well, could we do something on Koussevitzky with the BSO? And is there a specific date? We were exploring doing something around Dante with the anniversary just passed, and our modest holdings in that regard. But again, due to COVID and timing, that wasn't possible. So I think we're excited to get to that conversation. but I've got to caution us against moving too quickly on penciling in dates.
Well, COVID certainly remains a problem and an issue. But hopefully we'll get to show our wares soon.
Absolutely. We will have the opportunity with rare books and manuscripts reopening. There is a gallery display that's part of that lobby. I'm not gonna preempt our news on that front, but there are opportunities for more minor exhibitions, if you will, minor in scale, not in substance, to show off elements. So I think we can make a dent in that desire without necessarily jumping to what I would consider a full large-scale exhibition until we do the appropriate planning.
Okay. So without any further comments, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
So we don't need to have a recorded vote on this, do we, Pamela?
No, you do.
Okay. All right. So we're adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
And
Thank
see
you.
you next
Bye.
time.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.